When I was a small child, living in Brooklyn in the 90s, I was lucky enough to grow up in a two-family apartment-style home, on a relatively safe and quiet block. The upstairs apartment was occupied by my adult sister, while I lived in the larger first-floor apartment, with my parents. During that stage of my life I had my own bedroom, which was located toward the back of the house, with windows facing the small yard. My parents slept in the larger bedroom at the front of the house, with windows facing the street. During the day, my room was just an ordinary room, with a nice view of the small garden my mother kept, and the trees that separated the lots and obscured the neighboring houses. You could almost forget that you were actually in the city. At night, however, it felt like the inside of one of those old shacks you see in horror movies, isolated in the middle of nowhere, providing no security against whatever threat was pursuing you. Around that time, I started having a new recurring nightmare, one of many that would haunt me for years, before evolving into different nightmares. This nightmare would begin with me asleep in my bed, only to wake up and realize my curtains were open. I was terrified of the dark, and that section of yard would have dark areas, even with the light that came from the street lamps, so I made sure to close the curtains at night, so I wouldn't have to see it. I wake up within the dream, and my curtains are open, so I immediately rush to close them, because I don't want to see what might be out there, and more importantly, I didn't want it to see me. At the time, my child mind believed that if there was a threat outside, some monster, it wouldn't come to get me, unless it actually saw me, knew that I was there. It seems logical when you were a child, just as logical as using a blanket for defense. I would pull the blinds down, and close the curtains, but out of a concerned curiosity, I would take a peek through the blinds. In the distance, just at the edge of the yard, I would see a tall dark humanoid figure, a silhouette of a man, but hidden in the shadows. This alone would be enough to scare me awake, and I would rush to turn on the lights, only to see that the curtains remained closed, but I never dared to look out the window, and I would be too afraid to go back to sleep. This went on for several nights, the same exact way each time, until eventually the nightmare began to change slightly. At first, the figure was barely visible at the far end of the yard, just out of sight, but over time the figure would be closer to the house, closer to my window. The first time it was by the garden, just a few feet closer to my window. It remained hidden in shadow, but a little more of the silhouette could be distinguished. The figure was tall, with square shoulders, and what seemed like a long coat, that hung past its waist, but it was hard to see anything more in the dark. Later the figure would be even closer to the window, just past the garden, only a few feet away. It was then that I realized the figure wasn't just hidden by shadows, it was part of the shadows. It was completely dark, its clothes were black, and it seemed to wear a black, old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat, that concealed its face. I never saw it move, it would just stand there while I peeked through the blinds, before I would eventually wake up from fear. It was gradually getting closer over time, and I knew that one night it would be right outside my window, or maybe even inside my room. For months I had that dream, and every few days the figure would get closer, and closer, until finally one night it was pressed up against my window, looking into the room. Its face was hidden by shadow, but its eyes managed to be blacker than the surrounding shadows. I would wake up, and run out the room, avoiding looking at the window. The next night I would have normal dreams, or none at all. And I would never have that nightmare again, but that wasn't the end of it. Instead, I would eventually have other recurring nightmares, and before I would wake up, I would always realize that even though the threat looked different, the source was always the same. It was that shadowy man. For a long time I believed that dream was the start of it, the recurring theme of a shadow man stalking me in my nightmares, but only recently, after taking the time to remember those dreams, write them down, and turn them into spoken words on video, did I realize it actually started long before that. My earliest nightmare that I can remember was when I was just barely old enough to speak. It was always a brief dream. I was a toddler in a frozen land, wearing clothing made from animal skin and fur, part of a tribe it seemed. I was being placed in a large canoe, covered by more animal skins, and the canoe was set on a wooden rack, along other racks holding even more canoes. I remember the threat was rising frigid sea water. After being placed in the boat, the people who I identified as my parents would disappear from sight. The water would rise, and in the darkness of night, it looked pitch black, not like sea water, but like crude oil. In the end, before everything would go completely black, I would see it standing in the void. It was the Shadow Man, and I would wake up crying. That last part of the dream was lost in my memory for a long time until recently. I've been plagued by those nightmares since I was a child, all the way up until I was in my late 20s, and they would get worse with time, evolving into full night terrors, with sleep paralysis. I haven't really shared this with anyone, because the one time I tried, it didn't have a positive outcome. I was a teenager talking to a girl I liked and I opened up to her about it. But her reaction was not concern, or reassuring. In fact, she stopped talking to me completely after that, so I decided it wasn't something I should talk about. Eventually, the nightmares started to weaken once I started maturing, and gaining confidence in myself. And eventually, I would stop running in my dreams, and I would stand up to the threat, or realize it was a dream, and force myself awake. With time, I also learned to anticipate the sleep paralysis before it would take hold, and force myself awake. The dreams would occur less frequently and the night terrors would stop altogether. The last time I had one of those dreams was a few years before moving out of Brooklyn. I was already an adult, with a long-term girlfriend, who would occasionally spend the night with me. It had been a few years since I'd had one of those nightmares. In this dream I was calling to my girlfriend, who was in the bathroom, while I was in the living room. When she didn't answer, I went in to check on her. I found her standing by the bathroom window, holding a pair of scissors, blade down against her wrist. Concerned, I asked what was wrong, only for her to give a demented twisted smile, before trying to cut her wrists. I would grab the scissors, and try to shake her awake, when I would realize the reflection I saw in the window wasn't her reflection, but a twisted version of her standing outside the window. Once I realized that, the figure moved through the window, like a spirit, into the bathroom. I quickly pushed my girlfriend out into the living room, while standing between her and the twisted witch-like version of her. In my mind, it was trying to control her, and make her hurt herself, but it was also using her to reach me. The dream ended with me pushing the thing back out through the window in a rage. I was angry that it had returned. I wasn't a scared child anymore, I was just a fed-up adult. I woke up startled, with my girlfriend lying next to me, asleep. The next morning, I told my girlfriend about the dream, but she only understood it as being a simple nightmare, because she doesn't know the history I have with it. The multiple sleepless nights, that for a time would lead to insomnia, or the childhood fear of the dark, that persisted well beyond my teen years. I mentioned in a previous story, that I wanted to share my stories, and maybe entertain some viewers, but after writing a few, I think this might be more therapeutic than anything. And the more I write, the more I remember things that I managed to hide away in my mind. I just hope that by revisiting these past nightmares, I don't reawaken something that causes it to start over again. Time will tell, but as I said before, I am no longer a scared child. With age comes wisdom, but also acceptance that eventually everything will end, and as scary as that sounds, there is no point in being afraid of it, so why should I be afraid of something that only exists in my nightmares? Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, why not subscribe and share it?